and welcome to today's webinar, The Journey to DevOps from Waterfall to Continuous Integration. With us today is Chris Riley, DevOps Analyst from Fix8.io. Chris is a regular on our web series, and today we're in for a treat as he talks about one of our favorite subjects, which is DevOps. Chris is going to spend his time discussing the DevOps journey and how it impacts your team, your processes, and your IT environment as you transition from Waterfall to Agile, ultimately to that holy grail of DevOps that many of us are trying to achieve. In particular, the focus today will be on how the role of testing changes, and more importantly, how the QA function evolves as you shift left to development. This is a strategic webinar today in which Chris is going to showcase how large and small companies have made their own unique transition to a DevOps environment. So he has some very interesting case studies he's going to be highlighting for us towards the end of his slides. Hi, my name is Ken Drachnik, and I'll be moderating today's session. The Q&A panel, which is usually in the lower right-hand side of your screen, is the best place to enter your questions during the talk today. I will be moderating those, and we'll pick the pertinent questions as we go through the slides. And certainly at the end of the session, for the last 10 or 15 minutes, we'll hold a Q&A session and get to as many of those as we can. Again, we had several thousand people sign up for today's webinar. You won't see anybody in the attendees panel, but rest assured there are an awful lot of people on this event today as well. And lastly, we are recording today's session. Once it is ready, we'll send an email to you with all the links to the recording and the slides, and we hope that you'll share that with all of your colleagues who were not able to attend live for today's session. And with that, thanks so much for attending this morning, and I'll pass it over to Chris.
All right. Ken, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to the attendees. The number of registrations for this webinar is a true indication of not only the huge transformation that is going on today in the market, but also people's interest in understanding how to really get there, which is how we take this movement to the next step. So I'm excited that Sauce Labs has invited me back to speak about something that I love talking about, and I am able, I'm fortunate enough to write about this a lot in various forums, but not so much with such a large webinar. So this is a lot of fun for me. So here's our agenda. I'm not going to kill you with slides. I want to make sure that this is very conversational, because it really is a very strategic topic. No matter how much we may want it to be very tactical, it is a very strategic topic, and so it's good to have a conversation as to why the journey exists and where it's all going. So we're going to start off talking about what does the modern delivery chain look like, and how do we understand where we're going so that we can prepare to take the steps to get there, because after all, that is the job of all of us on the call, to make sure that our transformation is successful. Next, we're going to look at what actually is the DevOps journey. What is your starting point, and where are you trying to get? Then, obviously, one of the most interesting questions, because we are on a Sauce Labs webinar, is where does QA fit? Where does quality fit inside of this journey? I'll give you some tips on how to get started. And then finally, I'd like to review some tales, companies I have encountered and gone into detail with about how they've made the transition to modern software development. So let's poke a little fun at where we are today. And no matter what you do, you have some sort of strategy. And by doing nothing, that is actually a strategy. And so as we see here, we have a company that's in distress, but their response is to do nothing. That is a strategy. And many organizations have taken this approach. And it's not, when we talk about this transformation, it's not just a bottom-up initiative. There has to be buy-in from the top as well. And for those organizations that don't take that, then it can be challenging and it can be messy. And sometimes the best way to move into a modern development environment is to get a new job. I mean, it's reality. But with the proper buy-in, you can be very, very, very successful. The companies that decide just to stick with what they have, they will continue to chug along at the pace that they are. But no matter what industry they are in, software is a key component of their organization. It's hard to find an organization today that doesn't have some sort of application that is key to their business, even if it's internal. And if they don't consider modern development practices, that application is not going to be tremendously successful. Not only because the expectations of the market is extremely high and painted by app stores like the Apple App Store, where you expect new functionality fast, you expect bug fixes fast, it is driven by satisfying business goals, and they are closely intertwined anymore. And so that's where we get to the modern delivery chain. And I intentionally call it the modern delivery chain instead of yet putting any sort of label on it, because the label doesn't matter. The goal is always the same, and the goal has never changed, honestly. It's just what we can do anymore is we have much more opportunities with modern tooling and modern practices. But the goal has always been faster, more frequent releases at a higher quality. You can't take any of those elements out, and it's absolutely true. We want to get more functionality to our users faster and not sacrifice quality, but increase quality. So it's not just keeping up with the speed, it's actually making our applications better. And so the modern delivery chain has several aspects. And the first thing I have put on here is modern architectures. What's unique about the current movement is that there is also an implication on application architectures. I'm sure you've heard the term microservices. This is not just an infrastructure concept. It is an entirely different way to architect your application. And the reason that's important is within microservices, it is easier to embrace a DevOps environment than larger applications of the past. And so application architectures are something that have to be considered here. Whereas previously, when we talked about application lifecycle management, ALM, that really wasn't the case. And you didn't think so much about the architecture, but they're fully entwined. And when we say full stack development, we not only mean the operating system up to the application layer, we actually mean the delivery chain that it's a part of, because they are so interconnected, and that's how the modern delivery chain can be responsive. And so to do this, obviously we are moving faster, but we also have to allow ourselves to operate with experiments and allow ourselves to fail. And the only way this is possible is by going from chunked releases to truly a stream of code, where near the time that the code is being created, the functionality is being created, it has already started to move into integration environments. It's already started to be tested, and it gets to production way faster than it ever did before. And this is a concept that's called shift left. There's other terms for it, but shift left I really like because it makes sense. What it does is it takes the burden of the integration and the release process and move it closer and closer to the developer. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the term technical debt. This also helps with technical debt, because issues are moved over to the developer, which means they're caught faster, which means technical debt is less and less expensive, because the sooner you caught, everybody's heard about the sooner that you catch a bug, the less expensive that bug becomes. And it's absolutely true. But immediately you start to wonder, well, this is a huge burden on your software developers. And it is. It is more things that they have to consider than they ever did before. But it doesn't mean it's bad. And we have opportunities to mitigate and manage those. And it also calls into question where QA fits. And QA's role in this modern delivery chain is actually very, very important. What I want people to understand is that there is no finish line in the modern delivery chain. You don't ever get there. You don't ever say that we are a DevOps shop. You can say that we follow the DevOps principles, but DevOps is not an end. This is a journey. And part of the reason for that, and part of the reason that mentality is so important, is if you treat DevOps as this thing that you set up and you're done, then you're not going to be ready for the next thing. And if you're not ready for the next thing, that's not DevOps, that's Waterfall. So yet again, you're going to be in a scenario where the system that you've built is going to be dated. It's probably dated at the point that you finish it. Where DevOps delivery chains will allow you to take new source repositories, put them in and put them out whenever you want, to augment your delivery chain with new tooling that helps you do your job better. And so you really have to design for what I call the next, which is you always have to be prepared for the next thing that's coming. And that is where you have to consider automation and flexibility. So we're calling this DevOps. We're calling it a journey. The term DevOps is just a way for us to have a conversation. You can hate the term. It doesn't really matter. Like I said before, the goal is always the same, but it allows us to have the conversation. And it's only fair for me to go back and define really what DevOps is, because I told you it's a practice. I told you it's not a thing. There's actually two DevOps, and we have 2,000 plus registrations to this webinar, which means we have 2,000 plus definitions of what DevOps is. And a lot of times it comes from your perspective. But I think it's fair to say that there's DevOps the function and DevOps the movement. DevOps the function is the role that you would consider, which is the DevOps person who's often a conduit between development teams and IT, and often responsible for making sure that the developers are efficient, which is the infrastructure, the automation to support the development environment. It's a very tactical thing, and it's a very important thing, and neither one of the definitions holds one weight over the other. But there's also DevOps movement, and the DevOps movement is fluffy. I'll admit it. It is fluffy, but it's probably the most important fluffy, subjective stuff that you need to pay attention to. And that is what defines the practices. It defines the culture. It defines the mentality that really derives these environments. And time again, every trade show I attend, I want somebody to tell me, this is your DevOps thing. Here you go. These are the steps you follow. And I haven't found it. And I've been talking to organizations that are quote unquote unicorns in the DevOps space in the Silicon Valley who have amazing environments. And they all are saying the same thing to me as well. The element of fluff is there, and you have to deal with it, and you can't ignore it, and it is a part of this. So that is the DevOps, the movement. And I think when you have the conversation around DevOps, it's worth distinguishing between those two. And we're going to talk about both, especially when I get into the stories. We're going to cover both of the elements.
Hey, Chris, I think that you make a really good point there, and some of the questions we're getting are, is DevOps dependent upon technology, and does the language you select have a huge impact on your DevOps journey. So I think what you're saying rings very true to that there is no technology solution for DevOps.
You're absolutely right. Yeah. The conversations I've entered, it's funny because I'm an analyst, so I like to walk through the entire process when I talk to people. But where we always end is we always end on a conversation that has nothing to do with technology. We always start with a conversation that has to do with technology. And when I'm talking to these all-stars, like the director of engineering at Dropbox, the technology is almost the easiest part. And if you say the word automation to them, yeah, automation, so what? I mean, it's so assumed that you do automation. So you could say that the DevOps stack does have particular elements. Automation is one of those elements. And technology and tooling is one of those elements. But so is everything above that, which is probably the most difficult aspect, which is team, which is culture, which is process, that also requires a lot of consideration when you're building out this environment. To the question of, what language do you need to use? I think that it's safe to say, there's modern development languages that are more conducive to DevOps, and there's certainly applications like line of business applications which are not conducive to DevOps environments. But I wouldn't isolate it, and I've actually been corrected on this previously. I recently encountered a company which works in high performance computing, and what they were interested in DevOps. I'm like, okay, so your application's written in C++, and why are you interested in DevOps? And not to mention all of the web-based functionality they've built around this high performance application, but they have a lot to learn just by living the principles of DevOps. It may not look like a Dropbox ever, but that's fine. That doesn't mean that they're locked out of it. So I would say that no language is really blocked from being a DevOps environment. Great, thanks for that question. So let's look at what the journey actually is. We said at the beginning of the webinar, it's waterfall to continuous integration, and you can actually go further than that. And the more opportunistic type environments are talking about canary releases. A lot of people like to compare themselves to Google, and I try to avoid this, but in this case, I will say that Google does canary releases every second of every day. So that is like the bleeding edge of a DevOps environment, and it's a process you can consider. But it's not applicable to everybody. But there are steps, and we can isolate those steps. And what we're calling at the left side, which we know here on this graph, is waterfall. We all know what waterfall is. It's 6 months to 1 year to 3 year projects. You define all the requirements up front. You build it, the application against those requirements. You do user acceptance testing, and that's when things start to fall apart. Eventually, you finish what you're building, and by the time you finish it, it's probably lost some of the functionality than you originally thought because there were no iterations built in, so you didn't learn. And until the point of user acceptance testing, so you have to make concessions, and your application is already dated once you release it. So very problematic today, and not really an option for most applications. There are some legacy applications out there that you have no choice, but something that most organizations are trying to get away from. And I'd say that the vast majority of the organizations fall in the category of Agile. On the slide, it says fast waterfall. And to some people, when I've used this term before, and I've heard it more and more, fast waterfall can seem a little offensive. Like, well, we've adopted Agile. We're an Agile environment. We use sprints. It doesn't need to be offensive. Now, think of Agile. DevOps is not necessarily killing Agile. Agile has an organizational and a team aspect to it, so stand-up meetings and things of that sort. Those don't have to go away. Burn downs and all of that stuff are still useful tools in terms of planning and organizing your team and structure. So that portion of it doesn't necessarily go away. But when it comes to releases, Agile has been very misleading. You might be releasing every 2 weeks, but what you've done is you've taken the waterfall principle and just shrunk it down. And that's easy to do because you've created these things called sprints, which have less functionality than you would do in a major waterfall type monolithic application. And so really what you're doing is fast waterfall. And the reason I can prove that is go and count the number of delayed releases that you've had in the last year. And you'll find out very quickly that the behavior of these 2-week sprints is very much like a 6-month waterfall project, just dramatically condensed. And so it's not agile in the sense that most organizations have not built in iterations. It's still very sequential. So that's when we get into continuous integration, continuous delivery, continuous deployment, which in my opinion are two very separate things. And what this is saying is as you code, there is no gate. There is no stop point. As you code, testing is happening. As you code, you're releasing. And so it's truly like a stream of consciousness, a stream of code that's coming through your environment. And this implies architectures, it implies setup, but it's mostly a process. So in continuous integration, when the developer makes a pull request, the application is built, deployed into continuous integration environments. It is run across probably at that point a subset of your test suite, and you get results. So you get feedback much quicker. Who gets the results? The developer gets the results. The QA team measures the results so that you can respond to new functionality in days. And it's just ongoing and it's on demand. And there's a ton of implications of this. There's a ton of infrastructure implications, but fortunately, solutions like Sauce Labs have cloud infrastructure that reduce the burden of making that shift, because making that transition in some environments can be tricky. And I'm going to talk about a case study on that specifically. Continuous integration is still pretty self-contained within the development environment. When we start to talk about continuous delivery and deployment, delivery is up to release, deployment is actually releasing. It's exactly the same stuff. It's just once you go to deployment, what you're testing is different. So you're testing the entire test suite. At that point, once you do continuous deployment, you expect everything to run green. If it doesn't, and it doesn't frequently, then something's wrong in continuous integration. And so it just moves the needle further. And I'll be honest, I don't know that continuous deployment is relevant for every application out there. But in my opinion, continuous integration is. Continuous integration should be used everywhere. Continuous deployment is a nice goal, but it may not have the business value. And if it doesn't have the business value, there's no real reason to do it. So I've already kind of laid out the aspects of a DevOps environment. And this analogy of DevOps being this thing like an assembly line and in manufacturing, it holds true. Unfortunately, it's a little cliche, but it actually really holds true, where you have these products going through an assembly line and it's just ongoing. You have these warehouses of parts that have to be assembled, and you have to make sure that the parts are good, and there's QA, and everything is kind of there. Now, I would argue that a typical assembly line does not allow you to change the feature of a car in the middle of the processing. So that's a little bit where the DevOps principle kind of interjects itself and is different, but it's a good way to visualize what you're doing and help build your organization around. Now, when we talk about an assembly line and when we talk about being efficient, we're not just talking about our applications, we're talking about our delivery chain as an actual thing. Think about your software delivery pipeline as an application. And in most organizations that are doing DevOps or following DevOps, I just contradicted myself there. Following DevOps, they actually version their pipeline. It is an application. You should be iterating on the pipeline itself. You should be measuring the pipeline itself. You should be preparing for changes. And the way you do that is pipeline as code. Infrastructure as code. I mean, you've heard all of these terms, but really your pipeline itself is scripted out. And you can talk about it in terms of in application terms like you're used to talking about the code that it's delivering. And this allows you to be flexible, which allows you to do things like fail better, fail fast. These are all other terms that are frequently used. What it means is that you're not afraid to make mistakes because you've built a pipeline that allows you to revert very quickly. So I'm going to go back to the concept of canary releases. A canary release is where you release new functionality to production before it's been tested. And I'm sure all of you on the call are going, whoa, that is crazy. It is crazy. And it implies certain types of applications. For it to be successful, you have to have a very large user base. But if you have that, it is successful. And what Canary Releases do is that you release a whole bunch of versions of your application with new functionality. Within minutes time, you see the user's reaction. If there's anything negative at all, you revert back to the previous version, usually done via DNS routing and using containers and microservices. So it does imply application infrastructure. But that idea of being able to roll back to previous versions is extremely important. And that's something that organizations have to consider, is how do you be responsive? So that implies things like doing quality testing in production and some other unique concepts there.
Hey, Chris, you did a great job of defining kind of DevOps. And we had a question here is DevOps really just a business term, or do you see this, the educational institutions and colleges and things starting to teach about DevOps practices?
Fantastic question. Yeah. And I think that goes back to what I was saying before, that there's really is two DevOps. It's both, but the point, it is a business. It absolutely is a business term. And the reason that's important to understand is that without the top-down buy-in, you're not going to get anywhere. But it is also a very tactical term. There is the DevOps Institute in other organizational structures. Will it be a course in college? No, I don't think it will. The course is going to be continuous delivery. The course is going to be continuous integration. The course is going to be pipeline management. It's going to be the processes within inside of DevOps. So everybody needs to know what DevOps is, but the tactics are in continuous integration, continuous delivery, continuous deployment, pipeline management. Those are, if I were to write a course today, that would be what the course is in. Yeah, that's a great question. So while we're here, and let's get to the heart of this, where does QA fit? QA is actually in a really unique position. But the organization has to treat QA not only as a first-class citizen, has to treat QA as a role that has a very unique perspective that nobody else in the delivery chain has. And that's the holistic point of view. QA sees everything in most organizations. Now, there's the older organizations where QA has their blinders and they're just testing specific portions. But in general, QA interacts with the developers. QA knows what the entire application looks like, most developers don't know what it's been shocking to me working in a lot of startups in the Valley, how developers get really excited when every 6 months they see the entire application. You know, they know their bit very well, but they don't know the entire application. QA does. QA knows what the delivery chain looks like. So they have this unique, holistic point of view, but there is a dramatic shift, and it implies a lot of things. And it's, even though sometimes it might be an uncomfortable conversation, it's a conversation that you have to have. So QA is going to transition to a strategy versus the ones doing the testing. So I am building the strategy for quality. I am not actually doing the testing. And as we talk about the case studies, you'll see how that's very much true. The QA function is going to be more technical. A lot of people have started using the term QE instead of QA, quality engineering. It's a technical role. Very often now, the QA person has been a developer previously, or has been a QA person, always had the aptitude towards QA, but been writing test automation and knows what automation looks like. They're going to have to be aware of infrastructure. They're going to have to know what Docker containers are. I've had a lot of people explain to me Docker containers have nothing to do with QA. They have everything to do with QA. And I actually think that Sauce Labs has some content specifically on that that's worth looking at. I think what happens is QA actually owns this continuous integration environment. So they own this portion of the delivery chain. They own how tests are run. They own where the test suite lives. They own how the test suite is administered. They also own the stewardship of quality to developers. And when I say stewardship, what I mean is that you're educating the developers on how to make sure that their code is up to snuff, basically, is producing the quality that is expected. And you're probably going, well, my developers don't care. In the modern delivery chain, they will care. Because as we talked about the whole shift left concept, developers are accountable. Previously, they were really accountable for anything other than getting functionality done. But in the modern delivery chain, they are accountable. They will get in trouble, and they will be punished for bugs. And you see this more and more and more. So they will come to you and ask for your help. They want to know how to increase quality because they're going to be punished for not producing code that is matching the quality. And they'll be punished for not running tests. And so you are educating them. You are making sure that they have the tools they need and you can guide them, which implies a big relationship change, I'll say. Now, the other thing is that QA, like I said, is going to own the CI environment. They're going to own the automation. They should be owning the tool selection, making sure that they get the right tooling in the organization. Again, you're probably saying to me, I don't have budget. QA teams often don't have budget. It often rolls up to R&D. But in your organization, if your organization has the buy-in, they know that QA is going to know better than anybody else what tools, what pipeline processes need to be put in place. If for no other reason, then your developers don't have time. Your DevOps people don't have time. This is you. This is your responsibility. QA doesn't go away. Quality doesn't go away. I would have a very strong argument with anybody who tries to tell me that. But it does change, and it does shift left, and developers are responsible for testing what they build. And that's really what shift left is. And I'll talk about that in more detail. So I believe that QA has a big influence on this. I've seen organizations where the DevOps movement was led by QA. I've met DevOps engineers who were QA people. Actually, that's more often I've encountered than a DevOps engineer being a software developer. And so there's a lot there. But where do you go? This whole idea of DevOps can be very frustrating because, like I said earlier, you want to know just where do I go? And I wish I had an answer for you. I think there's a lot of tools coming out that help guide you. There's a lot of strategies. Here's some things that I think are useful to consider. Number one is don't fight it. You should know in your organization what the movement is, where the movement's going. If the movement hasn't already started, then you might want to think to yourself, is my organization considering modern development? If they're not, do I need to make a change? Maybe that's the case. But if they are and they haven't gotten there yet, that's an opportunity for you to lean in and actually be a part of the transition. But really, you shouldn't fight it. And if you're on this webinar today, I believe you're probably not fighting it because you want to educate yourself, which is great. And so I think you're already there. You're already opportunistic. One of the interesting ways you can get started, and I don't know if you've noticed this, there's an interesting habit that happens with leadership across the spectrum, which is show them a dashboard, show them graphs, show them improvement. People love numbers. People love graphs. If you can actually demonstrate in some way that is not obstructive to your environment, you can actually show that, hey, we're releasing code faster, but our quality's gone down. Or, hey, we're actually slowing down. We're doing really fast waterfall, which is fine. We've committed to 2-week sprints, but our average sprint is 4 weeks. So if you can start to deliver some data, then you tell a story, and it's very tactical. And then you can come in and say, here's my idea. If we were to bring in test automation, functional testing in the cloud with a robust testing grid, if we were to do that, then I believe that the number of tests we can run go up, the quality of our test suite goes up, and we're going to catch more bugs. It's a long tail effort in a lot of organizations. You're not going to just flip the switch, which is fine. But you have to be committed to that effort. Then you need to show the power of test automation. Hopefully you have the latitude to build up some skunkworks sandbox environments where you can actually run your application testing via Selenium, do some functional testing with Selenium in a cloud like CloudShare, or sorry, Sauce Labs. And you can test your application on a functional test grid with the powerful Selenium language and just show what it does. Just show the speed, the performance, and how much faster it is than how you're currently run testing. And it's true for every organization. It's true for DevOps as well. If you have an ROI, if you can demonstrate an ROI, people listen. It's just hard truth. It may be hard to know what that means, and there's a lot of different types of ROI. Sauce Labs has a lot of tools that can help you actually calculate this. They have a document that goes into this in detail with specific examples, which I think is pretty powerful. But if you can actually demonstrate that you're going to save money, then everybody really listens. It's not as fun, but it definitely is a place to go. And then the other thing is communicate with your developers. Start helping them with quality. Start showing them what the impact is of them just moving fast without implementing quality inside of their application. So, go ahead.
Hey, Chris, yeah, so there's a question here is like, someone says, where should I start if they want to start learning more about DevOps? Should they read Gene Kim's book, The Phoenix Project, or what do you recommend for people to go for kind of basic information on this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So Gene Kim's The Phoenix Project is good. I think that it's somewhere in the middle of tactical and purely thought leadership and so forth. You know what I really like is case studies. The problem with case studies is they don't say step 1, step 2, step 3, do this. What they do is they tell you how other people have done it. And there's a whole bunch on Sauce Labs' website which are really good. A lot of times the vendors tend to publish case studies where the organizations are already kind of ahead of the curve, but that's still fine. And one of my examples I'll give you, they weren't ahead of the curve. But I would focus a lot on just hearing the stories of other people. A lot of the trade shows, sometimes you can't attend the trade shows, but they'll record videos of people going on stage and telling you how they did it. And you can go on a lot of blogs out there and just look at the stories of how people implemented their continuous integration, their continuous delivery, and you're going to learn a lot. So I think that's the best way. There is some formal education out there, but it's not, I wouldn't call it mature at this point. The most mature is what people have actually done, which leads very nicely into the next step. So I've prepared a list of 5 companies that I've interacted with directly, which I think have very interesting stories related to QA. And it crosses the spectrum. The first one is a unicorn, which means they were born DevOps and that's all they know, to organizations which you would never even think would even come close to embracing DevOps. So Acorns is an application that was mobile first. They are a micro trading application. Basically, you can buy into stock markets with very, very small investments that are pooled together with bigger investments. Very cool application. Now, what's interesting about this is that they were born DevOps, but the person who led the DevOps was the QA person. And actually, they don't have a DevOps engineer. They just have a very strong QA team. And not only is the QA team in this organization a first-class citizen, the QA team is actually basically telling the developers what they're going to do. The QA team is leading this. If you go on DevOps.com, you can find the case study on Acorns, and it's really staggering to see that the DevOps person is driving the entire environment and has a ton of authority on the delivery chain. But they're a unicorn. They were built bottom up and from scratch, DevOps. Now let's talk about an organization that we know, Airbnb, the site for booking, how do you say it? But people who have properties and they want to rent them out for a night or two and you can book. Airbnb is actually, in the world of modern technology, they've been around for a while. When they first started, DevOps was not really even a conversation. And obviously they were in the category of really fast Waterfall and Agile, and they were doing great things, and they have a very big development team, but the demands have picked up and users want certain things. And I was actually one of those curmudgeon users who had some complaints over their map functionality, but then they quickly fixed it. And it's really amazing how they made the transition. And it was a big change for them. Well, they're doing something very radical where they have the concept, the shift left concept, but they call it, if you build it, you test it. If you build it, you manage it. So the developers, everything the developer builds, they're responsible for the quality of it, which means they're doing the testing, and they're even concerned about how it's performing in production. And they're given production data on it. It's pretty remarkable. But they also have this idea of voluntary on-call and voluntary quality. And that's cool. My first impression was, no way does that ever work. It does. The reason it works is because the developers have been, and the entire development team has been explained the business value of what they do and why their code matters to the bottom line of the organization. And they've accepted it. And as soon as that happened, they cared. And so they are now willing to volunteer to test other people's code, to be on call. So that is a huge shift. Now let's go from there. It's an opportunistic SaaS-based company who kind of had modern development before they moved to DevOps, to the GSA. The GSA is a U.S. government organization who, if you want to buy a pencil in the government, it has to go through the GSA. They're responsible for facilities management. They're responsible for all purchase acquisitions in the U.S. government, with the exception of a few special, like the Department of Justice and so forth. Not somebody you would expect to know anything about DevOps nor care. Well, a new CTO came into the GSA who had a top-down mentality of what DevOps was and enforced it into the culture of the organization and demanded that they build a new solution. And this was a scenario where they did a full rip and replace. They ripped out they ripped off the Band-Aid. It was, it was hard, but they did it. And they built one of the most remarkable container-driven development environments that is out there. And what I tell people is, if the GSA is doing it and you're not doing it, that's embarrassing. This is a U.S. government organization who is just historically very slow at doing anything, but they're doing it. So you can't ever have the argument that organizations aren't. Very similarly is Task. It's an insurance organization, it's traditionally slow moving, but they've embraced DevOps. And what I like about them is that they focused a lot on the pipeline. The DevOps engineer, before he became the DevOps engineer at Task, was a QA manager, QA engineer at a previous organization. He came from a QA background. He was technical. He knew how to learn. He knew how to adapt. And he brought in the DevOps principles that the Task had never seen before. So this QA person actually introduced DevOps. The reason they did it is because they needed mobile applications for their customer base. It was very demanding. Their current development environment couldn't keep up with it, and they needed help. So there was a business need. They brought in somebody who understood quality, who understood application development, and brought in these practices. Perfect example, another example of a QA person leading the organization. And the final one is a large media conglomerate, which has hundreds of sites. Each site has its own development team, but they've centralized QA. So there's a QA strategy team inside of the central organization who builds strategy as a service, basically. So this team is responsible for delivering tools, delivering strategies to every separate development team to say, this is how you should do quality. These are the metrics you should have. This is how you should manage it. That is their QA team. The developers in each of the subgroups can basically do whatever they want. But the thing is if they don't follow the recommended services from the central team, they don't get support. So the developers aren't getting backed. And that, sure enough, is a great motivation to use the strategies and tools that were recommended to you. And so I also really like how they're so metric-driven, how they use the Sauce Lab CI dashboard to present quality to the rest of the organization and measure how long their tests take to run and deliver that data. So that is the case studies. And what I want you to really realize is that this is happening. It's not a joke. It's not fun. 2 years ago when DevOps first came out and everybody was fighting the terminology, and like I said, you don't even have to call it DevOps. Modern delivery chains are happening, and QA can be a part of it, and hopefully QA can drive it. There's no reason to isolate QA teams. Sometimes it's messy. Sometimes there's organizations where if you want to be a part of this, you just have to move on. But you need both the bottom-up and the top-down buy-in. You need to have a QA team which is holistic and drives the automation and the continuous integration environment. And so I think we're ready for some questions. I know I didn't leave too much time here.
That was wonderful, Chris. Could you just advance to the next slide? We had a number of questions about the Phoenix project. So it's Phoenix, P-H-O-E-N-I-X, like the bird rising from the ashes, by Gene Kim, G-E-N-E-K-I-M. This is a book that was recommended that all of us read at Sauce Labs. and it's a novelization about a fictitious company as they go from kind of waterfall production to DevOps environment. It's a fast read. I think it introduces everyone to the concepts in a very easy way, and it's also available on Audible and on Google Play and Apple Store so that you can listen to it if you have a long commute, like I do. So I recommend that people read that. Some questions came in about the case studies that you had there, Chris, and they're wondering if there's anything written about those, or is this just anecdotes that you're talking about?
All of them, I believe. Obviously, I know a lot about these case studies. I've written the case studies myself. They're all on DevOps.com, so you could do a search for the company name and my name, Chris Riley, or you can go to DevOps.com and do a search for the company name, and you'll find the case studies, the write-ups.
Great, thanks. So a continuing question that came in here was, we have people from both large companies and small companies who are attending the webinar, and I think for the small teams, it's probably pretty easy for them to make the transition to at least continuous integration in CD because they're already small, they're probably working in agile environments. The more pressing questions, though, are from, I think, the people in larger enterprises where they have mature legacy apps, they're not easily scalable, or the monolithic kind of apps. Do you have any recommendations for those kinds of folks?
Yep. Yeah, there is a size to DevOps. I'll be honest about that. DevOps has a size. It implies smaller teams, just like it implies smaller tests. But it doesn't mean the organization or the application is too big. You see very large, the GSA is massive, by the way. So there's another example, but the team that built the application was not massive. The reason it implies a size is you have to have good communications. Well, how does a large organization who already has those silos manage communication? A lot of people assume that the silos go away, and they don't necessarily go away. Organizations like Capital One, large bank, Wells Fargo, very large bank, the way they do it is they have a new layer, and the layer is called the shared services layer or the cloud services layer. The cloud services layer is that DevOps organization, and they may touch technology, they may not. Like in the media example, which is a very big organization, what you'll notice is that the quote-unquote DevOps team, so the people driving modern development practices, are communicating with the heavy IT to the small individual development units. And each of those development units could have their own DevOps person, or they may not, but it's a services layer. Think of it as like a library of tools and processes that the rest of the organization can leverage. But the smaller units have to have autonomy. They have to have a reason to use this library, but they have to have autonomy. And this is where I've seen it very successful. Wells Fargo still has a NOC. Wells Fargo still manages all transactions with very, very, very antiquated old systems, and I don't see that changing. But they just launched a new modern web application that's very nice, and they're keeping very current on it, still in the fast waterfall category, but they've done that through the services layer. That was the only way to do it.
Some questions came in about you talked about where QA fits into the whole DevOps transition and how they're moving to kind of quality engineering QE folks. There's a number of questions on how does manual testing fit into DevOps? Is that still something that's viable? Does that go away completely? Because we talk a lot about automation in DevOps, and they're curious about, I think, the ways that a lot of testing is done today, and how does that transition?
Yeah. Well, I think eventually manual testing does go away. There's certain things that you can't test via automation, and they're more flow-based things and perception-based things and so forth. And there's a lot of different, tools out there to take those on. But there is a certain level that doesn't change. But that really falls on the developer, I think, when they are testing their application, where they're actually looking at it. But it's become less and less and less. And I think sometimes organizations test too much. And they're over-testing, and they're focusing on really robust test scripts. I think in the modern world, there is a greater leniency towards messing up a little bit, you know, not massive bugs, but especially in visual elements of your application, as long as you can correct it quickly. And so where I see manual testing kind of converting is, again, to that strategy element, but I think it becomes more responsiveness. How do you respond when something doesn't happen? Because let's face it, even if you have the best manual testing in the world, something will slip through the cracks. Like, eventually your power will go out. A lot of people complain about cloud, saying, well, what if I can't access it? Well, what happens when you don't have power in your house? You can't access the internet at all. It will happen. I mean, that's just the reality. And so there's greater tolerance, but the rule of thumb in all the modern organizations I know is if you do anything more than 5 times, you automate it. And so that usually it covers pretty much in the manual, everything in the manual testing world.
Chris, thank you so much. As usual, it's always a fascinating webinar when you show up and talk about these more strategic topics. I know we had a lot of great. Oh, it's a wonderful thing. No, we had some great praise in some of the comments online. So again, thank you so much. We've run out of time this afternoon. I encourage people to take a look at the last slide. We've got a link to our white paper there that talks about the DevOps journey from waterfall to continuous delivery that Chris mentioned. We have recorded this presentation today. We'll send out the recording as well as a link to the slides by the end of the week. So everyone, thank you so much for attending and hope you have a great week.
Thank you.